The animal shelter was a symphony of chaos, a chorus of desperate barks and lonely meows that echoed off the cold concrete floors like the distant rumble of artillery fire. John, a veteran who had known the sound of battle in foreign lands where silence meant survival, found this particular noise far more unsettling than any combat zone he had navigated. He walked past cages of yapping puppies with boundless energy and hopeful hounds, with pleading eyes, their enthusiasm radiating through steel bars, but his weathered face remained unmoved. His gaze searched for something else entirely, something that would not demand joy or excitement from a man who had little of either to give. He was not looking for a new life to energize his quiet world, but rather a fellow soul who understood the profound language of stillness, who could exist in the spaces between words, where healing happened slowly and without fanfare. The shelter manager, a kind but weary woman named Sarah, whose tired eyes suggested she had seen too many animals returned, for reasons beyond their control, followed him with a hesitant expression that grew more pronounced with each kennel. They passed. When John finally paused before a kennel, in the far back corner, isolated from the others, like a prisoner in solitary confinement, she spoke softly, her voice carrying the weight of disappointment and concern. Inside, a large German shepherd lay with a regal stillness that commanded respect, his amber eyes fixed on John, not with the wild desperation of the other animals, but with a deep, calculating intelligence that seemed to measure and evaluate the man before him. A bright yellow sign on his cage read in bold, unforgiving letters, "Max, caution, aggressive, not suitable for adoption." Sarah explained with genuine sadness that Max was considered completely unadoptable, returned by his last family after only 3 days for being too hostile toward visitors, too protective of his territory, and too unpredictable around strangers. But John, whose own experience with being misunderstood ran deeper than most people could fathom, saw none of that supposed aggression. Instead, he saw a warrior standing his post with unwavering dedication, a guardian holding a silent vigil over something precious that only he could perceive. He saw a loneliness that he knew intimately, carved deep into his own heart during long nights overseas, and a strength forged in some unseen fire that had tested this animal's character, just as war had tested his own. In that moment, as their eyes met through the chain-link barrier, a bond was formed that transcended words, a silent understanding between two old soldiers who had learned that the world often feared what it could not comprehend. Disregarding all warnings and the growing concern in Sarah's voice, John knew his search was over, that this misunderstood guardian was exactly the companion he needed. Please support us by liking the video and subscribing to the channel so we can continue telling these important stories. John's move to the remote cabin nestled deep within the mystical embrace of Whispering Pines Valley was not a retreat from the world, but a pilgrimage toward something he had been searching for his entire adult life. It was a conscious step toward a peace he had only ever heard about in stories. Those half-remembered tales his grandfather used to tell on quiet Sunday afternoons, when the light filtered golden through lace curtains and time seemed to slow to a more gentle pace. His grandfather, a man of few words but deep wisdom, spoke of this very valley not as merely a place marked on a map, but as a sanctuary of the soul, where wounded spirits could find solace among ancient trees that had witnessed generations of joy and sorrow. He spoke with a distant look in his eyes of a dear friend, a kindred spirit and soulmate bound by dreams larger than themselves, and of a promise left unfulfilled among these towering pines and silent peaks that stretched toward heaven. The old man's voice would take on a reverent quality when he described the crystal-clear streams that sang lullabies to the moon, and the meadows where wildflowers painted the earth in colors that existed nowhere else on earth. Now, standing on the rough-hewn porch of his rustic new home with its weathered logs and stone chimney, John could feel the profound truth of those words resonating in the very air he breathed. The scent of pine and damp earth mixed with wood smoke carried stories on every breeze, while the whisper of wind through the towering firs seemed to welcome him home with ancient voices. This place felt less like a new beginning and more like a homecoming to a land that had been waiting patiently for his return. He wasn't just a man who had bought a piece of property. He was a descendant answering a generational call. A grandson stepping into a story that had been waiting decades for him to arrive and claim his place in its unfolding narrative. The solitude he sought was indeed here. But it was not the empty isolation he had expected. Instead, it was filled with the echoes of laughter and dreams, a spiritual resonance that made him feel connected to this land in a way he couldn't yet fully explain, as if he were finally placing a missing piece into the complex puzzle of his own identity and purpose. Max settled into his new life in the valley with a quiet dignity that seemed to perfectly match the ancient rhythm of this sacred place. The supposed aggression that had defined him at the shelter and made him an unwanted outcast seemed to melt away completely under the vast open sky, replaced by a calm and unwavering loyalty that ran deeper than mere training or conditioning. He became John's faithful shadow on long hikes through trails that wound between cathedral-tall trees, a silent companion by the crackling fireplace during evening hours when stories seemed to write themselves in the dancing flames, and a comforting presence during the long, dark nights when memories of another life, another war fought in distant deserts, threatened to surface like ghosts demanding attention. Max moved through the cabin and surrounding forest with the confidence of an animal who finally belonged somewhere, his large paws silent on pine needles as he patrolled their shared domain. Yet, despite this apparent transformation, one peculiar behavior remained unchanged, a strange and fierce ritual that both puzzled and intrigued John with its intensity and unwavering consistency. Max was intensely, almost sacredly, protective of the old, tattered kennel that John had brought back from his previous home at the shelter's insistence that familiar objects would help with the transition. It was a simple construction of weathered wood and rusted wire, worn by time and countless storms, bearing the scars and scratches of years of faithful service. But to Max, it was clearly something far more significant than mere shelter. Any person or animal that strayed too close to this humble structure, from the cheerful mailman making his daily rounds to curious deer emerging from the tree line at dawn, was met with a low, rumbling growl that promised serious and immediate consequences for any who dared to violate this sacred boundary. His entire demeanor would change in these moments, transforming from gentle companion to fierce guardian, his hackles raised and his amber eyes blazing with protective fire. But with John, he was completely different, allowing him to approach within arm's reach, his gaze watchful but trusting, as if he instinctively knew that John possessed some special understanding or permission that others lacked. John began to realize this wasn't mindless aggression born of trauma or poor socialization. This was focused, purposeful action with deep meaning behind every growl and every defensive stance. Max wasn't just guarding a physical object made of wood and wire. He was protecting something infinitely more precious, a secret that had been entrusted to his care, a responsibility that weighed heavily on his loyal shoulders. He was a sentinel posted at his station by forces beyond human understanding, a faithful soldier carrying out his last given order with unwavering dedication, waiting patiently for something, or someone, to finally arrive and relieve him of this sacred duty that had defined his entire existence. A few weeks into his new life, when the routine of mountain living had begun to feel natural and the peace of the valley had started to work its healing magic on his war-weary soul, John made the short but winding drive into the small town that serviced the scattered residents of Whispering Pines Valley. The town consisted of little more than a main street lined with weathered buildings that had stood sentinel against decades of mountain winters, each structure telling its own story of perseverance and community survival. It was there that he first encountered Eleanor, the elderly woman who ran the local general store, with the efficiency and warmth that only comes from a lifetime of serving neighbors who had become family. Her face was a roadmap of a long and well-lived life, etched with laugh lines and worry creases that spoke of joys celebrated and sorrows shared, while her eyes held the sharp intelligence of someone who had observed human nature for 8 decades and missed very little. She moved through her store with the confidence of absolute authority, knowing the location of every item and the needs of every customer before they even spoke. When she saw John step out of his weathered pickup truck with Max following closely at his heel like a devoted shadow, her warm, welcoming smile faltered dramatically, replaced by an expression of pure astonishment that transformed her entire face. A weathered hand flew to her mouth as she stared at the magnificent dog with growing recognition, and John could see a flicker of deep sorrow mixed with something that looked almost like relief washing over her features. "My lord," she whispered, her voice trembling with emotion. "That's Arthur's dog." The name meant absolutely nothing to John at that moment, just syllables hanging in the mountain air, but to Eleanor, it clearly meant everything, carrying the weight of years and memories and connections that stretched far beyond a simple introduction. She explained with growing excitement and sadness that Arthur, Max's former owner, had passed away peacefully in his sleep just a few months prior, leaving behind a legacy of kindness and a mystery that had puzzled the entire community. But the true shock came next, delivered with the gentle force of a revelation that would change everything John thought he knew about his place in this valley. Eleanor revealed that she had not only known Arthur well, considering him one of her dearest friends, despite the difference in their ages, but she had also known John's grandfather, a connection that stretched back through decades of shared history and mutual respect. They were more than friends, she said with tears beginning to gather in her eyes. They were inseparable companions, two halves of the same whole, brothers in all but blood who had shared dreams and secrets, and a bond that transcended ordinary friendship. With a heavy heart that carried the burden of old sorrows, she then spoke of a bitter, long-standing feud that had cast its shadow over the valley for generations, a dark conflict with another branch of Arthur's own family tree, the very branch that included Silas, whose reputation for cruelty and greed had preceded him throughout the region. Eleanor, her voice filled with the passion of someone who had witnessed injustice for too long, felt a deep and abiding sense of debt to the past, an obligation to protect the memory and preserve the legacy of the two friends she had admired and loved. Men who had represented the very best of what human friendship could achieve. In the days that followed Eleanor's earth-shaking revelation, the forest around John's cabin underwent a profound transformation in his perception, shifting from a simple collection of trees and wildlife trails into a living, breathing landscape filled with tangible history, a three-dimensional map to a past he was only just beginning to understand and appreciate. The very air seemed charged with significance, every shadow potentially hiding a story, every clearing possibly holding a secret that connected him to the grandfather he had loved but never fully known. He and Max spent their days exploring this newly meaningful territory, and it quickly became apparent that Max was not simply wandering aimlessly through familiar terrain. The magnificent dog moved with a quiet but unmistakable sense of purpose, his black nose pressed close to the earth as he followed invisible trails, his alert ears constantly attuned to secrets that only he could perceive with senses far sharper than human understanding. He led John not on random paths through the wilderness, but to specific, clearly significant locations that seemed to have been waiting patiently for this reunion. A sun-dappled clearing dominated by an ancient, gnarled oak tree whose massive trunk bore the faint but unmistakable scars of old carvings. A small, hidden waterfall that tumbled musically into a crystal-clear pool, reflecting the sky like a mirror, and a rocky outcrop that offered a breathtaking panoramic view of the entire valley spread out below like a painted masterpiece. With each carefully orchestrated discovery, another fragment of his grandfather's half-remembered stories would suddenly click into perfect place in John's increasingly amazed mind, like pieces of a jigsaw puzzle finally revealing their intended picture. This was the mighty oak tree where the two young friends had carved their initials with pocket knives, marking their territory and their bond for all time. This was the sacred pool where they had sworn solemn oaths of brotherhood under starlit skies, making promises that would echo through generations. This was the lookout point where they had planned their shared future, dreaming dreams that were larger than themselves. John began deliberately communicating with Max using the subtle but effective hand signals he had learned during his military service, and the intelligent dog responded with an almost human understanding that took John's breath away. A complex, silent language developed between them with surprising speed, a sophisticated bond forged not only in their shared solitude and mutual need for companionship, but in the gradually dawning realization that they were partners in a shared, inherited mission that neither of them fully understood yet, but both felt in their bones. They were no longer just a lonely man and his faithful dog seeking peace in the mountains. They were active participants in an unfinished story, dedicated partners on a quest that had been waiting decades for them to arrive, guided by the persistent ghost of an unfulfilled promise, and sustained by the unwavering loyalty of a guardian who had never forgotten his duty. The fragile peace that had begun to settle over Whispering Pines Valley like a comfortable blanket was violently shattered on a gray morning when Silas finally decided to make his presence known in a way that could not be ignored or dismissed. He roared up the winding dirt road to John's secluded cabin in a polished, oversized pickup truck that gleamed with aggressive newness, its chrome bumpers and tinted windows seeming offensively out of place against the rustic, timeless backdrop of the ancient forest that had stood unchanged for centuries. The truck's rumbling diesel engine announced his arrival like a declaration of war, disturbing the morning peace and sending wildlife scattering deeper into the protective shadows of the trees. Silas himself was a man whose barely contained ambition and simmering resentment were poorly disguised by a thin veneer of forced civility that fooled absolutely no one who looked closely at his cold, calculating eyes. He stepped out of his vehicle with the swagger of someone accustomed to getting his way through intimidation and financial pressure, his expensive boots crunching deliberately on the gravel as he surveyed John's property with the appraising gaze of someone already counting profits. This was not a neighborly visit or a friendly introduction to welcome a newcomer to the community. Silas had not driven all this way to make a reasonable offer on the house or to negotiate like a civilized human being. He came to make a demand backed by threats, to stake a claim that he believed was rightfully his, regardless of legal documents or current ownership. With a sneer that twisted his features into an ugly mask of entitlement and barely contained rage, he declared in a voice dripping with inherited venom that John was nothing more than a trespasser, an outsider who had no business being on land that, by right of some ancient and bitter family history that stretched back through generations of resentment, belonged to his bloodline and his bloodline alone. When John, drawing on the quiet strength he had developed through years of facing down more dangerous enemies than this small-town bully, refused to be intimidated by empty threats and groundless claims, Silas shifted his strategy with the cunning of a predator seeking a different angle of attack. He retreated to the town like a spider returning to the center of its web, ready to begin weaving a different kind of trap, preparing to wage a completely different type of war that would be fought with whispered lies instead of direct confrontation. He started planting seeds of suspicion and fear in every conversation, spinning elaborate tales of a dangerous, mentally unstable veteran with unpredictable violent tendencies and his supposedly vicious, unpredictable dog who had come to steal precious local heritage and threaten the safety of law-abiding families. His lies spread through the small community like wildfire in dry grass, turning neighbor against neighbor and creating an atmosphere of distrust and paranoia where none had existed before. Soon, the friendly waves from passing trucks that had become part of John's daily routine became noticeably fewer and less enthusiastic. The warm greetings in Eleanor's general store, those small but meaningful human connections that had made him feel welcome and accepted, were gradually replaced by guarded stares and hastily whispered conversations that stopped abruptly whenever he entered a room. John, who had come to this peaceful valley specifically to escape the harsh judgment and misunderstanding of the outside world, found himself once again cast in the familiar and painful role of outsider, a target of fear and suspicion based on lies and manipulation rather than truth or personal experience. The isolation he had once actively sought as a comfort and a refuge from the demands of a world that expected him to be something he was not now felt like a suffocating cage, its bars constructed from the calculated deceptions of an enemy he was only just beginning to understand and recognize for the dangerous threat he truly represented. Max, with the heightened sensitivity that comes naturally to animals who have learned to read human emotions and environmental changes with remarkable accuracy, seemed to sense this subtle but significant shift in the social atmosphere around them, his naturally protective stance becoming noticeably more pronounced. His powerful presence serving as a silent but unmistakable reassurance against an increasingly hostile world that no longer felt like the sanctuary they had both desperately needed. Silas, emboldened by the growing unease he had successfully cultivated throughout the previously peaceful community, and drunk on his own perceived power to manipulate public opinion, decided that a more direct and personally confrontational approach was not only warranted, but absolutely necessary to achieve his ultimate goals. He had grown impatient with the slow progress of his whisper campaign and wanted to apply more immediate pressure to force John into submission or retreat. One afternoon, when the autumn sun hung low in the sky and cast long shadows across the valley floor, he positioned himself strategically near the edge of John's property line, waiting like a predator for the perfect moment to strike. When John emerged from his cabin for his daily walk with Max, Silas stepped out of concealment with theatrical timing, his pretense of neighborly civility completely abandoned and replaced by the raw, naked animosity that had been festering in his heart for decades. This was no longer the cold, calculated manipulation of a greedy businessman seeking easy profit through intimidation and legal maneuvering. This had transformed into something far more dangerous and personal, revealing the heated passion of a man completely consumed by a generational grudge that had poisoned his entire worldview and shaped every decision he had made since childhood. His face was flushed with anger and righteous indignation as he stepped closer, invading John's personal space with the deliberate aggression of someone testing boundaries and looking for an excuse to escalate the confrontation to physical violence. "My grandfather told me stories about your family," Silas spat with undisguised venom, his voice rising with each word as years of suppressed rage finally found their outlet. "Detailed stories about every betrayal and every theft that your bloodline committed against ours. He told me how your grandfather, that supposedly celebrated friend that everyone speaks of so fondly, charmed and manipulated his way into our family legacy, like a snake in the garden, gaining trust only to steal what was rightfully ours and leave us with nothing but broken promises and empty hands. Your family built their entire reputation on lies and deception, stealing the future from my family and condemning us to generations of struggle and hardship that should never have been ours to bear. I am here to take back what you stole, to reclaim what belongs to my blood, and to finally balance the scales of justice that have been tilted in your favor for far too long. In that moment of raw, unfiltered honesty, John understood with perfect clarity the true nature of what he was facing. Silas was not simply a villain in a straightforward property dispute motivated by simple greed or opportunism. He was the inevitable product of a toxic story told and retold countless times across kitchen tables and family gatherings, a carefully cultivated narrative of grievance and betrayal that had festered like an infected wound for decades, passed down from father to son like a poisonous inheritance. He genuinely saw himself as the righteous hero of his own dark and twisted tale, a noble avenger finally stepping forward to reclaim a stolen birthright and restore his family's honor after years of suffering in silence. As Silas continued his venomous monologue, Max moved with fluid grace and deadly purpose to position himself directly between the two men, his massive frame creating an unmistakable barrier of fur, muscle, and unwavering loyalty. This was not an aggressive lunge born of panic or poor training, but rather a deliberate, calculated placement executed with the precision of a military maneuver. A low, guttural growl began to rumble deep in his chest, a sound that seemed to originate from the very depths of the earth itself and carry the weight of ancient authority. It was not just the warning of a protective pet defending his owner from a perceived threat. It was the primal sound of an ancient enmity finally awakening after years of dormancy, the instinctual recognition of a generational foe whose very presence activated genetic memories of conflict and betrayal, a powerful confirmation that this bitter fight had started long before either John or Silas had ever drawn their first breath and would likely continue long after they were both gone unless someone had the courage to finally break the cycle. The escalation from Silas had pushed John beyond the boundaries of patience and into the realm of necessity. The sabotage of his truck had been a clear declaration of war, a crossing of the line from intimidation into attempted murder that could not be ignored or reasoned away. That night, as he sat by the dying embers of his fireplace with Max's warm weight pressed against his legs, John made a decision that would change everything. He had been dancing around the mystery of the kennel for weeks, respecting Max's fierce guardianship while trying to understand its significance through observation alone. But the stakes had risen dramatically, and answers could no longer wait for gentle discovery. The next morning, with the sun casting long shadows through the pine trees and the air crisp with the promise of approaching winter, John approached the weathered kennel with deliberate purpose. Max, sensing the shift in his master's demeanor, watched with intense concentration, his amber eyes following every movement. When John knelt beside the structure and began examining it closely, the dog's usual protective growl was notably absent. Instead, Max stepped forward with what could only be described as resignation mixed with relief, as if he had been waiting for this moment his entire life. With careful fingers, John explored the base of the kennel until he found what Max's behavior had been protecting all along, a loose board that shifted slightly under pressure. Beneath it, wrapped in oiled cloth that had protected it from years of weather and time, was a metal box that felt heavy with more than just its physical weight. As John lifted it from its hiding place, Max let out a soft whimper that sounded like the release of a burden carried too long, the faithful sentinel finally able to relinquish his post. Inside the metal box lay the fragments of a story that would reshape everything John thought he knew about his grandfather, his inheritance, and his place in this valley's complex history. The contents were carefully organized and preserved, each item wrapped separately and arranged with the meticulous care of someone who knew their importance. There were official documents bearing government seals and legal stamps that certified ownership of mining rights to a silver deposit hidden deep in the mountains surrounding the valley. The paperwork was old but meticulously maintained, signed by both John's grandfather and Arthur's grandmother in a partnership that predated their children's generation. But more precious than any legal document were the personal letters exchanged between the two families, written in the flowing script of a bygone era when correspondence was an art form and words carried the weight of sacred promises. The letters revealed a friendship that transcended mere business partnership, describing a bond forged in mutual respect and shared dreams of using their discovery not for personal enrichment, but for the betterment of their entire community. They wrote of plans to establish a fund that would ensure the valley's preservation for future generations, to build a school where children could learn both academic subjects and the ancient wisdom of living in harmony with the land. The silver mine was not meant to be exploited for quick profit, but managed as a sustainable resource that would provide for the community's needs while protecting the natural beauty that made their home special. Most significantly, the letters revealed why this treasure had to remain hidden for so many years. Arthur's grandmother wrote of her growing concern about certain members of her family, particularly a nephew whose greed and lack of moral compass made him dangerous to their carefully laid plans. She feared that if he discovered the mine's location, he would strip it bare without regard for environmental consequences or community benefit, turning their dream of sustainable prosperity into a nightmare of exploitation and destruction. The final letter, dated just months before both elderly partners passed away, contained detailed instructions for their descendants and a solemn promise that when the right time came, when someone worthy appeared who could carry forward their vision with wisdom and integrity, Max would be the key to unlocking this legacy. The revelation hit John like a thunderbolt of understanding that illuminated every strange behavior and protective instinct Max had displayed since their first meeting at the shelter. Max had not simply been guarding a kennel or protecting territory out of instinct or training. He had been faithfully executing the most important mission of his life, serving as the designated guardian of a multi-generational trust that represented the hopes and dreams of two families united in their vision of a better future. Arthur had trained him not just as a pet, but as a living safe, a sentient repository of family secrets who would recognize the rightful heir when he appeared and surrender his burden only to someone worthy of carrying it forward. The intelligence John had sensed in those amber eyes was not just the natural cleverness of his breed, but the focused dedication of a creature who understood the magnitude of his responsibility and had never wavered in his commitment despite years of waiting. Now, as John held the precious documents and felt the weight of inherited obligation settling on his shoulders, he understood why Max had seemed to choose him at the shelter, why the supposedly aggressive dog had shown such immediate trust and loyalty. It had not been chance or simple compatibility, but recognition, the fulfillment of a destiny that had been waiting patiently for the right moment to unfold. Max had been waiting for him specifically, not just any kind owner, but the descendant of his first master's most trusted friend, the one person who could be trusted to honor the promises made by previous generations. The dog's seemingly random guidance through the forest now made perfect sense as deliberate education, leading John to sacred places and significant landmarks so he would understand and appreciate the full scope of what he was inheriting. Every protective growl, every moment of fierce vigilance, every refusal to let strangers near his post had been motivated by unwavering loyalty to a mission that spanned generations and represented the very best of human cooperation and environmental stewardship. But even as John marveled at the scope of this discovery and felt the profound satisfaction of finally understanding Max's mysterious behavior, he knew that possession of these documents had placed them both in mortal danger. Silas had already demonstrated his willingness to commit attempted murder in pursuit of what he believed was his rightful inheritance. The knowledge that a valuable silver mine actually existed on the property, backed by legal documentation that proved John's legitimate ownership, would drive the desperate man to even greater extremes of violence and ruthlessness. The brake line sabotage had been a warning shot, a crude attempt at intimidation that could have easily resulted in death. Now that the stakes were revealed to be far higher than a simple property dispute, John realized that Silas would stop at nothing to claim what he had convinced himself belonged to his family by right of blood and grievance. The very existence of the documents represented an existential threat to Silas's version of family history, proof that his inherited narrative of betrayal and theft was built on lies and resentment rather than facts. Confronted with evidence that his grandfather had been excluded from the mining partnership not through deception, but due to his own character flaws and untrustworthiness, Silas would likely become even more dangerous as his carefully constructed worldview crumbled around him. John understood with military clarity that they were no longer dealing with harassment or intimidation, but with a genuinely desperate man who had nothing left to lose and everything to gain from eliminating the obstacles to his obsession. The isolation that had once felt like peaceful sanctuary now seemed like dangerous vulnerability, leaving them exposed and defensible against an enemy who knew the terrain and had already proven his willingness to kill. Eleanor's warnings about Silas's reputation for ruthlessness took on new urgency as John realized they were facing not just a greedy opportunist, but a man whose entire identity was tied to reclaiming what he believed had been stolen from his bloodline. That very evening, as if summoned by John's growing awareness of the danger they faced, Silas chose to escalate his campaign of terror to a new level of personal violation and direct threat. Under cover of the moonless darkness that turned the valley into a landscape of shifting shadows and concealed dangers, he crept onto John's property with the stealth of a predator stalking prey. His target was not the cabin itself, but the various outbuildings and vulnerable points where he could inflict maximum psychological damage while maintaining plausible deniability. Moving with the practiced ease of someone who had clearly done this before, Silas methodically went about his work of intimidation and sabotage. He slashed the tires on John's ATV, rendering it useless for emergency transportation or quick escape. He cut the phone line that connected the remote cabin to the outside world, isolating John from potential help or communication with authorities. Most ominously, he spray-painted threatening messages on the side of the tool shed, crude warnings about what would happen to outsiders who refused to leave when they were no longer wanted. But his most psychologically devastating act was the deliberate destruction of several items that held obvious sentimental value. Family photographs and personal mementos that had been left on the front porch, smashed and scattered as a message that nothing John valued was safe from violation. The attack was designed not just to cause inconvenience, but to create a sense of helplessness and vulnerability, to demonstrate that physical distance and privacy were no protection against someone determined to cause harm. Max, whose senses were far more acute than his human companions, detected the intrusion immediately and spent the entire night in a state of high alert, growling softly at shadows and patrolling the perimeter of their property with the intensity of a soldier on guard duty. By morning, when John discovered the extent of the vandalism and realized how completely exposed they had been during the night, the message was unmistakably clear. This was no longer about property rights or family history, but about survival itself, a contest of wills that would be resolved only when one side was completely defeated. The discovery of the morning's damage marked a turning point in John's approach to the escalating conflict, transforming him from a man seeking peaceful resolution into a strategic military mind preparing for inevitable combat. His years of training and combat experience, skills he had hoped to leave buried in the past, suddenly became relevant and necessary for protecting not just his own life, but the precious legacy he had inherited and the loyal companion who had kept faith across generations. He spent the day conducting a thorough security assessment of his property, identifying vulnerabilities and potential defensive positions with the same methodical attention to detail he had once applied to foreign battlefields. The cabin's location, which had seemed perfectly peaceful and isolated when he first arrived, now revealed itself as tactically challenging, surrounded by forest that could provide cover for attackers while offering limited escape routes for defenders. But John also recognized certain advantages in the terrain, natural choke points, and elevated positions that could be used to control access and monitor approaches. More importantly, he had Max, whose superior senses and fierce loyalty made him worth an entire squad of human allies. The dog had already proven his ability to detect threats and his willingness to fight to protect their shared mission. Together, they began preparing for what seemed like an inevitable confrontation, checking equipment and supplies while making plans for various scenarios that might unfold. John cleaned and loaded his hunting rifles, not with aggressive intent, but with the grim recognition that they might need to defend themselves against a man who had already attempted murder once and would likely try again. As the sun set on that day of preparation and planning, both man and dog understood that their peaceful life in the valley was over, replaced by a state of siege that would continue until the conflict reached its final resolution. The weight of the metal box and its precious contents seemed to grow heavier with each passing hour, a reminder that they were now the guardians of something far more valuable than personal safety, protectors of a dream that had survived one generation and deserved to survive another. The storm that had been brewing on the horizon for days finally arrived with the fury of nature unleashed, but it brought with it a far more dangerous threat than wind and snow. Silas, driven beyond rational thought by his consuming obsession and the knowledge that his window of opportunity was rapidly closing, made a decision that would have seemed impossible for a civilized man just weeks earlier. He armed himself with his grandfather's old hunting rifle, loaded his truck with survival gear, and set out into the blizzard with the single-minded determination of a man who had convinced himself that murder was not only justified, but necessary. The howling wind and driving snow that made travel treacherous for any sane person became his allies, providing cover for his approach and masking the sound of his vehicle as he navigated the treacherous mountain roads. Silas had grown up in these mountains, knew every deer path and logging road, every cave and hollow where a man could shelter from the elements or launch an attack. What he lacked in military training, he made up for with local knowledge and the desperate cunning of a man fighting for what he believed was his birthright. The blizzard that had begun as a natural phenomenon transformed into the perfect battlefield for a final confrontation, where visibility was measured in feet rather than yards, and the line between hunter and hunted could shift with each gust of wind. As he abandoned his truck at the bottom of the valley and began the difficult climb toward John's cabin on foot, Silas felt the intoxicating rush of a predator closing in on prey that had nowhere left to run. The hunt that followed was unlike anything John had experienced even in the chaos of foreign battlefields. A deadly game of cat and mouse played out across a landscape, transformed by the storm into an alien world of shifting white death. Every tree became a potential hiding place, every drift of snow a possible ambush point where an enemy could wait in perfect concealment. John moved through his familiar forest with the heightened awareness of a soldier in hostile territory, every sense straining to detect the presence of another human being in the wilderness around him. But he was not alone in this fight, and Max proved to be worth far more than any human ally could have been in these conditions. The dog's superior hearing could pick out the crunch of footsteps on snow from hundreds of yards away. His sensitive nose could detect human scent, even when the wind scattered it in all directions, and his dark coat made him nearly invisible against the shadows of the pine trees. Working together with the wordless coordination they had developed over months of companionship, John and Max turned the tables on their pursuer, transforming from hunted prey into active participants in a tactical engagement. John used his military training to read the terrain and anticipate Silas's movements, while Max served as an early warning system and mobile reconnaissance unit. They led their enemy on a twisting path through the deepest parts of the forest, over fallen logs and around massive boulders, through areas where the snow was deepest and the footing most treacherous. At strategic points, John would use techniques learned in survival training to create simple but effective obstacles. A tripwire made from fishing line that would send an unwary pursuer tumbling into a snowbank, a carefully balanced branch that would snap back when disturbed and create enough noise to reveal an enemy's position, loose rocks positioned to slide and clatter when stepped on. Each trap bought them precious time and provided valuable information about Silas's location and intentions, turning the hunter into the hunted through superior tactics and intimate knowledge of the battlefield. The chase continued for hours through the storm, a grueling test of endurance and determination that pushed both men to the limits of their physical and mental capabilities. Silas, driven by decades of accumulated resentment and the desperation of a man who had staked everything on this final gamble, refused to give up despite the punishing conditions and the growing realization that his prey was far more formidable than he had anticipated. John, drawing on reserves of strength and cunning developed through military service and months of mountain living, used every advantage at his disposal to stay ahead of his pursuer, while gradually leading him toward a destination that offered hope for resolution. That destination was the silver mine itself, the hidden treasure that had started this deadly conflict and now represented the only chance for ending it. The mine's location had been carefully concealed by previous generations, accessible only through a narrow ravine that wound deep into the heart of the mountain range, hidden behind a waterfall that had frozen into a curtain of ice during the storm. John had studied the maps in the metal box and combined that information with Max's mysterious knowledge of secret paths to locate the entrance, understanding that the mine represented not just sanctuary, but the final battleground where this generational conflict would reach its conclusion. The approach required climbing over treacherous ice-covered rocks and squeezing through openings that seemed barely wide enough for a human body, challenges that would test the determination and physical capabilities of anyone who sought to follow. As they made their way toward this ultimate destination, John felt the weight of history pressing down on him, the knowledge that he was about to enter a place that held the dreams and hopes of his grandfather and his grandfather's dearest friend, a sacred space that had been protected and preserved for this moment of reckoning. The entrance to the silver mine was even more impressive and forbidding than John had imagined from the old maps and faded photographs in the metal box. Hidden behind the frozen waterfall like something from a fairy tale, the opening appeared as a dark mouth in the rock face, barely visible until one stood directly in front of it and peered through the curtain of ice. The tunnel beyond stretched into darkness that seemed to swallow their flashlight beams, supported by timber beams that had aged to the hardness of stone during decades of faithful service. As John and Max made their way into the depths of the mountain, their footsteps echoed with the hollowness of a cathedral, and the air carried the mineral scent of silver ore mixed with the mustiness of long abandonment. The mine was larger than John had expected, a complex network of tunnels and chambers that represented years of careful extraction, guided by respect for the mountain's natural structure. His grandfather and Arthur's grandmother had not simply blasted their way through rock in search of quick profit, but had followed the veins of precious metal with the patience of artists, creating a masterpiece of sustainable mining that could have provided wealth for generations without destroying the environment that contained it. Emergency supplies were still stored in waterproof containers throughout the complex, evidence of the foresight and planning that had gone into this operation. Kerosene lanterns hung from iron hooks driven into the tunnel walls, and there were even sleeping areas where workers could rest during extended operations. But most importantly, the mine represented safety from the storm raging outside and a defensible position where John could make his final stand against an enemy who had proven willing to commit murder for the sake of inherited grudges and imagined injustices. As they penetrated deeper into the mountain's heart, Max's behavior became increasingly alert and focused, as if he recognized this place from genetic memory or ancestral training, confirming that they had reached their intended destination. The confrontation that John had been dreading and anticipating finally materialized when Silas appeared at the mine entrance like a vengeful ghost emerging from the storm. His face was twisted by cold and exhaustion into a mask of determination and barely controlled rage, his clothing torn by thorns and his hands bleeding from the difficult climb over ice-covered rocks. The rifle in his hands was pointed with unwavering steadiness directly at John's chest, and his eyes held the flat, emotionless stare of a man who had moved beyond moral considerations into the realm of pure obsession. Snow and ice clung to his hair and beard, giving him the appearance of some primitive hunter from an earlier, more brutal age, and his labored breathing created clouds of vapor in the cold air that made him seem like a dragon preparing to breathe fire. There was no longer any pretense of civilized negotiation or legal process in his approach, no attempt to justify his actions through reference to family history or inherited grievances. This had become a simple matter of might makes right, a contest that would be resolved through violence because Silas no longer possessed the patience or emotional stability for any other solution. "This ends now," he declared in a voice hoarse from shouting over the wind during his pursuit through the storm, the words echoing off the stone walls with the finality of a judge pronouncing sentence. "You're going to give me those documents, and then you're going to disappear from this valley forever. I don't care what lies your family told you or what fairy tales you've been believing. This mine, this land, everything your grandfather touched belongs to my blood, and I'm taking it back tonight." The confrontation escalated with shocking suddenness when Silas, perhaps responding to some perceived movement or simply driven beyond endurance by the sight of his enemy standing calmly in what he considered his rightful inheritance, began to apply pressure to the rifle's trigger. John, whose combat reflexes had never fully left him despite years of civilian life, recognized the telltale signs of a man preparing to fire and threw himself sideways, just as the weapon discharged with a deafening roar that seemed to shake the very foundations of the mountain. The bullet struck the tunnel wall where John had been standing, sending a shower of rock fragments and ricochets bouncing through the enclosed space with deadly unpredictability. But even as John hit the ground and rolled toward cover behind a support beam, Max was already in motion, his powerful legs launching him across the tunnel with the speed and precision of a guided missile. The magnificent dog's timing was absolutely perfect, his body striking Silas just as the man was attempting to work the rifle's bolt action for a second shot. The impact sent both the weapon and its wielder tumbling backward toward the tunnel entrance, and for a moment it seemed as though the confrontation might end with Silas disappearing back into the storm from which he had emerged. But the tunnel floor was treacherous with loose rock and accumulated moisture, and what had begun as a simple tackle evolved into a chaotic struggle that sent both combatants rolling and sliding across the slippery surface. John, recovering from his defensive dive and realizing that the fight was far from over, rushed forward to help Max subdue their attacker before he could regain control of the situation. The three figures grappled in the flickering light of the emergency lanterns, their movements casting wild shadows on the tunnel walls as they fought for position and advantage in the confined space that had become an arena for settling generational grievances. The violence of their struggle had consequences that none of the combatants could have anticipated or prepared for, consequences that transformed their personal conflict into a fight for survival against the mountain itself. The combination of gunfire and physical impact had disturbed the delicate balance of forces that had kept the mine stable for decades, and the ancient timbers that supported the tunnel entrance began to groan and shift under stresses they were never designed to bear. What started as a few pebbles falling from the ceiling quickly escalated into a cascade of loose rock and debris that rained down on the struggling figures below. The sound was terrifying in its intensity, a rumbling roar that seemed to come from the very bowels of the earth as tons of stone and timber began to settle under the influence of gravity and structural failure. John, recognizing the sound from his experience with controlled demolitions and building collapses in war zones, shouted a warning that was barely audible above the growing thunder of the cave-in. But his words came too late to prevent the inevitable, and with a final, apocalyptic crash that seemed to shake the entire mountain range, a section of the tunnel roof collapsed completely. A massive timber beam, probably weighing several hundred pounds and as thick as a telephone pole, came crashing down with enough force to crush bones and pulp flesh. Through a combination of luck and lightning-fast reflexes, John managed to throw himself clear of the main collapse, but he was not entirely unscathed. Smaller rocks and debris pelted him like hail, opening cuts on his face and arms and leaving him battered and disoriented. Silas was not so fortunate, and his scream of pain and terror cut through the rumbling avalanche like a knife as the massive beam struck him across the legs, pinning him beneath its crushing weight and ending his threat as an active combatant. The tunnel entrance, their only connection to the outside world and their sole means of escape, was now completely blocked by tons of fallen stone and timber, transforming their underground battlefield into what might very well become their tomb. In the sudden, deafening silence that followed the collapse, broken only by the occasional settling of loose debris and the labored breathing of injured men, John found himself in a situation that tested every survival skill he had ever learned and every moral principle he had ever held. Both he and Silas were trapped beneath hundreds of feet of solid rock, with no apparent means of escape, and no way to communicate with the outside world. The air in the tunnel, though still breathable for the moment, would not last indefinitely in their sealed environment, and the temperature was already beginning to drop as the thermal mass of the mountain began to draw heat from their confined space. Silas lay motionless beneath the fallen beam, his face pale with shock and pain, blood seeping from wounds that John's military medical training told him were serious, but probably not immediately life-threatening. The man who had moments before been trying to commit murder now looked pathetic and helpless, his rifle buried somewhere beneath tons of rubble, and his dreams of reclaiming his family's imagined inheritance reduced to the simple desire to survive long enough to see daylight again. Max, though shaken by the violence and chaos of the collapse, appeared to have escaped serious injury through a combination of quick reflexes and protective positioning. The dog moved carefully through the debris field, sniffing for alternate routes and testing the stability of remaining structures with the instinctive caution of an animal whose survival depends on accurate assessment of environmental dangers. John, despite his own injuries and the overwhelming nature of their predicament, felt his military training taking over. The systematic approach to crisis management that had kept him alive through countless dangerous situations overseas. The first priority was medical triage and stabilization of injuries, followed by assessment of available resources and potential escape routes, and finally the development of a survival plan that would maximize their chances of rescue or self-extraction from their underground prison. The transformation in their relationship dynamic was as sudden and complete as the collapse that had trapped them together in the bowels of the mountain. Silas, who had entered the mine as a would-be murderer, driven by generations of imagined grievances and burning resentment, now found himself completely dependent on the mercy and medical skills of the man he had been trying to kill just moments before. The crushing weight of the timber beam across his legs had not only ended his physical threat, but had also shattered something deeper in his psyche, the carefully constructed narrative of victimhood and righteous anger that had sustained him through years of planning and preparation for this moment of reckoning. Faced with the immediate prospect of death in the cold darkness of an unmarked grave, the inherited hatreds that had seemed so important and justified just hours earlier suddenly appeared petty and meaningless. John, drawing on battlefield medical training that he had hoped never to use again in civilian life, worked methodically to assess and treat Silas's injuries, despite having every reason to leave his enemy to suffer the consequences of his own violent choices. The beam was too heavy to move without mechanical assistance, But John was able to determine that while Silas's legs were probably broken, major blood vessels appeared to be intact, and there was no immediate threat of fatal hemorrhage. Using torn strips of cloth and improvised splinting materials scavenged from the mine's emergency supplies, he stabilized the injured limbs as much as possible and made his enemy as comfortable as the circumstances would allow. This act of compassion in the face of attempted murder spoke to something fundamental in John's character: the ingrained military ethos that wounded enemies still deserved medical treatment, and that civilized men did not abandon others to preventable death, regardless of their past actions. As John worked over his injuries, Silas's eyes filled with tears that had nothing to do with physical pain, and everything to do with the overwhelming recognition of his own moral bankruptcy and the generosity of a man he had wronged beyond forgiveness. The emotional breakthrough that followed was as dramatic and complete as the physical collapse that had preceded it, a moment of human connection that transcended the artificial barriers of family feuds and inherited grievances. As John finished bandaging the worst of Silas's wounds and sat back on his heels to survey their desperate situation, his enemy began to speak in a voice choked with emotion and barely controlled hysteria. The words that poured out were not the angry accusations and self-righteous demands that had characterized all their previous interactions, but the confused and pain-filled confessions of a man whose entire worldview was crumbling like the tunnel around them. Silas spoke of childhood stories told by bitter relatives, tales of betrayal and theft that had been passed down through generations like a toxic inheritance, growing more distorted and venomous with each telling. He admitted that he had never questioned these stories or sought independent verification of their truth, accepting them as gospel because they provided a convenient explanation for his family's failures and disappointments. The mine and the land around it had become symbols in his mind, representations of everything his family had lost and everything they deserved to reclaim. But he now realized that his obsession with possessing them had cost him his humanity and nearly his life. Through tears of genuine remorse and self-recognition, he acknowledged that John had saved his life, despite having every reason to let him die. An act of grace that he knew he did not deserve and could never adequately repay. The man who had entered the mine as an enemy emerged from his psychological collapse as something approaching a fellow human being, humbled by pain and proximity to death into recognizing the fundamental decency of the man he had tried to destroy. Max, whose instincts were far more attuned to emotional states than complex human politics, seemed to sense this transformation and gradually relaxed his protective stance, though he remained watchful and ready to intervene if the situation deteriorated. Even as John worked to treat Silas's injuries and process the emotional revelations of his enemy's breakdown, a more immediate and practical crisis demanded his attention. The collapse had not only trapped them beneath tons of rock and timber, but had also compromised the mine's ventilation system, sealing off the natural air circulation that had kept the tunnels habitable for decades. The air in their confined space was already beginning to feel stale and heavy, and John's military training told him that they had perhaps hours rather than days before carbon dioxide buildup became a serious threat to their survival. Moreover, the temperature in the tunnel was dropping steadily as the thermal mass of the mountain drew heat from their bodies, and hypothermia would become a factor long before they ran out of breathable air. The emergency supplies cached throughout the mine included blankets and survival gear, but these resources would only delay the inevitable unless they could find a way to signal for help or discover an alternate route to the surface. Max, who had been conducting his own exploration of their prison, suddenly began to behave in a way that caught John's attention and sparked hope where none had existed before. The intelligent dog was focused intently on a section of the tunnel wall that appeared solid to human observation, but his behavior suggested that his superior senses were detecting something that escaped human perception. He was sniffing and pawing at what seemed to be solid rock, whimpering softly and looking back at John with an expression that clearly communicated urgency and purpose. Following the dog's lead, John discovered that what appeared to be a solid wall was actually a carefully concealed entrance to another section of the mine, blocked by loose stones that could be moved by hand once their location was identified. Behind this hidden barrier lay a narrow passage that sloped upward toward what John fervently hoped was an alternate exit, an emergency escape route that the original miners had constructed as a safety measure against exactly this kind of catastrophe. While John and Silas struggled for survival in their underground prison, the storm that had provided cover for the deadly confrontation was beginning to show its effects in the valley below, where Eleanor had been growing increasingly worried about John's safety and well-being. The elderly woman possessed the kind of intuitive understanding that comes from a lifetime of watching weather patterns and human behavior, and she knew that something was terribly wrong when John failed to appear for their scheduled weekly visit to her general store. Her concern deepened when she noticed that Silas's truck was nowhere to be seen around town, and she began to connect the dots between his absence and John's unexpected failure to maintain his reliable routine. Eleanor had lived through enough mountain winters to understand that the current blizzard was exactly the kind of weather that could provide perfect cover for violence and criminal activity, when the isolation that normally protected the valley's residents could become a deadly trap for anyone unfortunate enough to attract the attention of dangerous people. Her growing anxiety finally reached the point where she felt compelled to take action. Despite her advanced age and the dangerous driving conditions that made travel treacherous for even experienced mountain drivers. She made the difficult journey to Sheriff Brody's office through snow-clogged roads and zero-visibility conditions, her ancient pickup truck sliding and fishtailing, but somehow maintaining enough traction to reach town safely. Sheriff Brody, a man whose calm competence had earned the respect of everyone in the community, listened to Eleanor's concerns with the attention they deserved and immediately recognized the potential seriousness of the situation she was describing. He had been keeping a watchful eye on the escalating conflict between John and Silas, and Eleanor's report of both men's simultaneous absence during a major storm triggered alarm bells in his experienced law enforcement mind. Working with Eleanor to reconstruct the most likely sequence of events, Brody began organizing a search and rescue operation that would have to contend with some of the most challenging weather conditions the region had seen in years. The search and rescue operation that Sheriff Brody assembled represented the very best of small-town cooperation and mountain community resilience, with volunteers emerging from the storm like heroes answering a call to arms. Despite the dangerous conditions and the late hour, experienced outdoorsmen and local guides rallied to the cause, bringing with them specialized equipment and intimate knowledge of the terrain that would be essential for conducting an effective search in blizzard conditions. Eleanor, despite her age and the obvious dangers of the expedition, insisted on accompanying the search party. Her knowledge of the historical landmarks and hidden locations that John might have sought as shelter proving invaluable to the rescue effort. She guided the searchers to areas that appeared on no modern maps, places known only to longtime residents who had grown up hearing stories about the valley's hidden treasures and secret refuges. The rescue team moved methodically through the storm, using techniques developed through years of finding lost hunters and stranded travelers in the unforgiving mountain environment. They followed vehicle tracks where possible, called out names when the wind allowed their voices to carry, and used powerful spotlights to search for any signs of human presence in the white wasteland that the familiar forest had become. The search was complicated by the fact that the storm was actively erasing evidence of passage, filling in footprints and tire tracks almost as quickly as they could be identified. But the searchers persisted with the determination of people who understood that lives hung in the balance, and that giving up was simply not an option. Hours passed with no success, and some members of the team began to voice concerns about their own safety and the wisdom of continuing the search in conditions that were rapidly becoming life-threatening, even for experienced mountaineers. The breakthrough that saved 3 lives came from an unexpected source, delivered through the storm by a hero whose loyalty and determination had never wavered, despite the deadly circumstances that surrounded him. Max, working with desperate intensity in the narrow passage he had discovered, had managed to clear enough loose stone to create a small opening that connected their underground prison to the outside world. The opening was far too small for human escape, barely large enough for the determined dog to squeeze through. But it represented their only hope for communication with the rescue teams. They prayed were searching for them in the storm above. Max's emergence from the mountain was nothing short of miraculous, a testament to his intelligence and unwavering devotion to his human companions. Despite being exhausted from hours of digging and disoriented by the raging blizzard, he immediately began the behavior that had been bred into his lineage for generations. He started barking with a volume and intensity that could penetrate even the howling wind, a sound that carried the desperate urgency of life and death communication. His barks were not the random vocalizations of a frightened animal, but a deliberately sustained signal, repeated at regular intervals with the persistence of someone who understood that rescue depended entirely on attracting attention and maintaining contact until help arrived. The sound of his voice, cutting through the storm like an audible beacon, represented hope made manifest, the promise that somewhere beneath the snow and rock, human beings were still alive and fighting for survival. The rescue team's discovery of Max emerging from what appeared to be solid mountainside was a moment of pure relief, mixed with renewed urgency and determination. Sheriff Brody, whose experience with search and rescue operations had taught him to recognize the significance of every clue and follow every lead, no matter how unlikely it might seem, immediately understood that the dog's appearance represented their first real break in what had been an increasingly hopeless search. Max's condition told a story of underground struggle and desperate escape, his coat matted with rock dust and his paws torn from hours of digging through stone and debris. But more importantly, his behavior indicated that he had not simply escaped from danger, but was actively trying to lead them back to something or someone who needed their help. The intelligent dog alternated between frantic barking that demanded attention and purposeful movement back toward the opening from which he had emerged, a clear communication that rescue was needed and that time was running out for those still trapped below. The rescue team immediately began the complex process of widening the opening that Max had created, using specialized equipment and techniques designed for cave rescue and mountain emergency response. The work was dangerous and technically challenging, requiring careful assessment of structural stability to avoid causing further collapses that might harm the people they were trying to save. But the knowledge that living people were trapped just beyond their reach gave the rescuers energy and determination that transcended normal human limitations, and they worked with the focused intensity of people who understood that every minute counted in what had become a race against time and the forces of nature that surrounded them. The moment when the rescue team finally broke through to the trapped men was charged with emotion and relief that was almost overwhelming in its intensity. The first face that appeared in their improvised rescue shaft was Sheriff Brody's, his experienced features showing the strain of the search, but also the profound satisfaction of a successful rescue against impossible odds. Behind him came other members of the rescue team, bringing with them medical equipment, warm blankets, and the promise of safety that had seemed impossible just hours earlier. The scene that greeted the rescuers was one that would remain etched in their memories for the rest of their lives. John, battered and exhausted, but alert and functional, kneeling beside his former enemy and providing medical care with the competence and compassion of a trained professional. Silas, broken physically and emotionally, but alive and conscious, his eyes showing a mixture of pain and gratitude that spoke to profound personal transformation. And Max, who had somehow found his way back to his human companions through the treacherous passage he had cleared. standing guard over both men with the protective stance of a sentinel who had never abandoned his post. The rescue operation that followed was a masterpiece of coordination and technical skill, with the rescue team working methodically to stabilize both injured men and prepare them for the difficult extraction that lay ahead. Silas, whose injuries were the most serious, required careful immobilization and pain management before he could be safely moved through the narrow passage that represented their only route to freedom. John, despite his own injuries and exhaustion, assisted in his own rescue and that of his former enemy, his military training and medical knowledge proving invaluable in the confined space where professional rescue techniques had to be adapted to challenging circumstances. The extraction took several hours of careful work, but eventually both men were brought to the surface, where ambulances waited to transport them to medical care, their survival representing a victory for human decency and the kind of heroism that emerges when ordinary people face extraordinary challenges. In the weeks that followed their harrowing rescue from the collapsed mine, the truth that emerged from the metal box and its precious contents transformed the entire narrative that had governed Whispering Pines Valley for generations. The legal documents, authenticated by experts and verified through historical records, provided irrefutable proof of John's legitimate ownership of both the property and the silver mining rights, completely vindicating his grandfather's reputation and exposing the lies that had poisoned Silas's family for decades. The personal letters between the two friends revealed a story of honor, cooperation, and shared vision that stood in stark contrast to the bitter tales of betrayal and theft that had been passed down through Silas's bloodline like a toxic inheritance. Local historians and legal scholars who examined the evidence concluded that the original exclusion of Silas's ancestor from the mining partnership had been based entirely on legitimate concerns about his character and intentions, not on any deception or conspiracy. The community, led by Eleanor and Sheriff Brody, rallied around John with a warmth and acceptance that acknowledged both the injustice he had suffered and the grace he had shown in saving his enemy's life, despite having every reason to let him die in the darkness beneath the mountain. Silas, facing serious criminal charges for attempted murder and assault, found himself confronting not only the legal consequences of his actions, but also the complete collapse of the worldview that had shaped his entire adult life. The revelation that his family's grievances were built on lies and misunderstandings rather than actual wrongs forced him to reevaluate everything he thought he knew about justice, inheritance, and the obligations that one generation owes to the next. The man who had entered the mine as a would-be killer emerged from his hospital bed as someone beginning the long, difficult process of taking responsibility for his actions and attempting to make whatever amends were possible for the harm he had caused. The transformation of John's relationship with the valley and its people was as dramatic and complete as the physical healing that slowly restored his strength in the aftermath of their underground ordeal. Using the wealth generated by the carefully managed development of the silver mine, he began implementing the vision that his grandfather and Arthur's grandmother had dreamed of decades earlier but never lived to see realized. The first project was the establishment of a community trust fund that would ensure the valley's environmental protection for future generations, while providing sustainable economic opportunities for local residents through ecotourism, sustainable forestry, and artisanal mining techniques that respected the land's natural beauty. Working closely with Eleanor, whose knowledge of local needs and community dynamics proved invaluable, John created educational programs that taught young people about their region's history while providing them with skills and opportunities that would allow them to build meaningful lives without leaving the place they loved. The second major project was the construction of a state-of-the-art animal rescue facility that would serve the entire mountain region, a sprawling complex of modern veterinary facilities and comfortable housing that could accommodate hundreds of animals in need of care and homes. The facility was officially named the Arthur and Max Memorial Animal Sanctuary, honoring both the human friend whose wisdom had made it possible and the canine hero whose loyalty had protected the dream across generations of waiting. Max himself, now recognized throughout the region as a local hero whose intelligence and courage had saved human lives, seemed to understand the significance of his new role as the sanctuary's unofficial mascot and chief of security. He moved through the facility with the quiet dignity of an elder statesman, greeting visitors and staff with friendly interest while maintaining the watchful protectiveness that had always defined his character. John found in this work not just the peaceful retirement from conflict that he had originally sought in the valley, but a deeper sense of purpose that connected him to something larger than himself. He and Max had become true partners in a mission that honored the past while building something valuable for the future, their friendship deepened by shared trials into something that transcended the ordinary relationship between human and animal. The lessons learned in the darkness of the collapsed mine continued to resonate through John's daily life, long after his physical wounds had healed, and the immediate crisis had passed into memory. The experience had taught him that the most important battles were not always fought with weapons on distant battlefields, but sometimes in quiet moments of moral choice when one person's decision to show mercy or seek revenge could determine the course of multiple lives and future generations. Standing in the main hall of the animal sanctuary on a crisp autumn evening, watching Max interact gently with a group of children who had come to learn about animal care and responsible pet ownership, John reflected on the strange turns that had brought him to this place of peace and purpose. The man who had come to the valley seeking only solitude and healing had found instead a calling that connected him to his community and his family's legacy in ways he never could have anticipated. The discovery that his inheritance included not just property and mineral rights, but also the responsibility to honor friendships and promises made by previous generations had given his life a dimension of meaning that no amount of personal success or individual achievement could have provided. The conflict with Silas, terrible as it had been in its potential for tragedy, had ultimately served to clarify what truly mattered in life and what kind of man John chose to be when faced with the ultimate test of character. Sometimes, John realized, the deepest loyalties are not sworn in words, but are carried in the heart across generations, waiting for the right soul to finally bring them home. The bond between human and animal, between past and present, between individual conscience and community responsibility, formed a web of connection that was stronger than any force that sought to divide or destroy. Max's unwavering loyalty had not only saved their lives in the immediate crisis, but had also demonstrated the kind of faithful commitment that made civilization possible and life meaningful. The story of John and Max's adventure had spread far beyond the boundaries of Whispering Pines Valley, inspiring people throughout the region with its themes of loyalty, forgiveness, and the power of individual courage to overcome generational hatred and misunderstanding. If these stories of courage and redemption have touched your heart and reminded you of the loyal companions in your own life, please take a moment to share your own experiences with us in the comments below. Tell us about a time when an animal friend showed extraordinary loyalty or intelligence, or when you witnessed the kind of forgiveness and grace that John showed to Silas in their darkest hour. These personal stories create a community of shared values and mutual support that extends far beyond any individual narrative, reminding us that we are all connected by the common experiences of love, loss, loyalty, and the daily choice between bitterness and hope. If you believe these stories deserve to reach others who might find inspiration and comfort in tales of unwavering devotion and hard-won peace, please subscribe to our channel and share this content with friends and family members who understand the special bond between humans and their animal companions. Your support helps us continue bringing these important stories to audiences who need reminders that even in our darkest moments, loyalty and love can light the way forward, and that redemption is always possible for those brave enough to choose forgiveness over revenge. Another powerful story is now appearing on your screen, ready to continue this journey of discovery and inspiration that celebrates the very best of the human spirit and the creatures who choose to share their lives with us. Click on it to explore more tales of courage, loyalty, and the kind of love that transcends species and transforms lives in ways that seem miraculous, but are actually available to anyone willing to open their heart to the possibilities that surround us every day. We extend our deepest gratitude to all veterans and their families, and to the faithful animal companions who serve as healers, protectors, and reminders that some bonds are stronger than time, stronger than fear, and strong enough to carry us home when we have lost our way in the wilderness of life.